Lippitt, owner of the Hill Street Group and host of Communication is an Art, the podcast. I'm a communication strategist, a public speaker, and a leadership trainer. Most weeks, I'll be joined by other communication specialists, but every few weeks, you'll hear from just me to equip you, the listener, with practical tools and strategies to navigate through your day with confidence. These podcasts are always non-scripted and conversational. So let's dive into this together. Welcome to Communication is an Art. I'm Pam Lippitt, and I am your host today. I'm going to introduce my guest in a couple minutes. Welcome if you're listening morning, noon, or night, watching on the full unedited conversation on YouTube. We welcome you to let us know where you're watching from and send us any questions or comments you may have. I started this podcast to really talk about communication and how many different forms it takes. And so my guests are from various backgrounds and use their communication skills in various ways and on various platforms. So today I'm going to welcome in, and here she comes. Hold on. I'm going to welcome in Elaine Belson. We've never met in person, but we are both part of Innovation Women, and I am so pleased to welcome you here today. She's the Ask the Therapist on YouTube. Oh, I may have to go in and ask a few of my own questions when we're done with this. So welcome, Elaine. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and yourself, and then we'll just dive in.
Okay, so I've been a clinical social worker for 30 years, most of that in private practice. But at the age of 42, I joined the Army and was a social work officer. And I got to deploy to Afghanistan, where I served as XO for Medical Command. So that was an exciting time in my life. Beyond that, so I mostly in the past have done psychotherapy. I've had my own practice. I also do coaching and speaking. And as you mentioned, I am a host of a YouTube channel called Ask the Therapist, where I answer your mental health questions in under a minute.
Wow. So you can save my life in under a minute. I love that. But what I really wanted, which is not part of our communication piece, but I really want to know why or what drove you, besides your car, to enlist at 42 into the Army. I think our listeners, our viewers are all asking the same thing, right? So
I get that question all the time.
Right. I always like to ask the question if you always get asked it. So.
Yes. So most of my life, I always wanted to be part of something bigger than myself and to have a bigger impact. And it came by accident. We went to an air show at Andrews Air Force Base, close to where we live. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought this really fits what I was looking for. And I also am someone that, I don't know why, but when there's a crisis, I do the opposite. I just become really calm. So I thought that would also, work well for me in the military. So those are really the reasons.
I mean, there are those two principles, fight or flight. Now, while you weren't actually fighting, fight to me is driving forward, is forward momentum. Flight is obviously moving away from a situation. So you chose the fight piece, which is very admirable. And, I thank you for your service. I hope people do that all the time. And why don't you tell us a little bit about how you served in the Army, kind of. I know you told me when we did our pre-interview, that's not a surprise to anyone who listens or hosts a podcast, that we talked for a few minutes before. You told me that you worked a lot with a domestic abuse and abuse cases. So
Right.
what lessons did you give to people? What lessons did you learn? And how did communications kind of weave its
Right.
way into all that?
Right. Well, I really believe that communication is key in general, no matter what setting you're talking about, no matter what the relationship, um, and even with domestic violence. So so as a social work officer, our role in garrison, that is when we're not deployed, was to handle domestic violence cases primarily, right?
Like on
And
bases
so,
here,
I'm sorry?
on the bases in the US.
Correct.
Okay.
Exactly. Right. I was at well, Fort Liberty now. It was Fort Bragg. They changed the name.
And
Um,
that's New Jersey, right?
yes, North Carolina. No, North
Oh, North
Carolina.
Carolina.
Sorry.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Anyway, so one of the things that I did was I led an anger management group for soldiers. And so we talked a lot about communication, about, if you want to be heard, you have to communicate in a way that you're likely to be heard, that's not going to shut the person down or put them on the defensive. So, staying calm is really important. We also talked about communicating in terms of emotion. People hear feeling words a lot better than they do labels or accusations, right?
So give us an
Um,
example.
okay, well, I let's say that I'm talking to you, Pam, and you don't answer me, and I say, Pam, why are you ignoring me? And you probably would say, I'm not ignoring you. I was just wrapped up in something I was doing, right? And
So you're already
so,
on the defensive.
right, right. I put you on the defensive. But if I say, Pam, when you didn't respond to me when I asked you a question, it made me feel ignored, or it made me feel like you weren't interested in what I had to say.
And
You
so
see
my
how that sounds
response
different?
to that would be, "Oh, I didn't mean that." Is that not defense, a different kind of defensive?
Well, oftentimes what people assume is that if they explain themselves, that the person's going to feel better. And what I find most of the time, no matter what the circumstances, this is just human nature. When you try to explain yourself, what the other person's going to hear is you're wrong for the way that you feel, and here's this really good reason why.
Yeah, my answer to that is always, "I'm sorry, those are my feelings, and they're not subject to your interpretation, but they
Exactly. You
belong
can
to me."
understand. Right,
Yeah.
you can understand where a person's coming from and still be impacted by their behavior. And so the point is, it's not as though one or the other is valid. They're both valid.
I had a cousin. We haven't spoken in 30 years, so I feel fine
Oh,
telling this story. When he was a little boy, he just was like, he was very sensitive, but at the same time, and I'm talking like 3 years old, he was also, so he was defensive about himself on what, like very sensitive about himself, but could also give like jabbing words to someone else. And my mother, in frustration, finally said to him, "You hurt my feelings." And at 3 years old, he said, "I didn't know other people have feelings."
of course.
And okay, so we haven't talked in 30 years, but that's for a different story, but a lot about feelings as well. But the idea that you get to belong to your feelings, I think, is so critical in communication, because it really sets you up. And sometimes I even say to someone, if I'm really serious, when I say I feel like this and I'm allowed to feel like this. So I've precipitated them saying to me that's not correct. Because I've already told them I get to belong to my feelings get to belong to me. Facts
Exactly.
can
You
belong to
can't
all
tell
of us.
somebody how they feel.
Right,
So that's one of the reasons why using feeling words is effective.
right,
Plus the fact that everyone, as you pointed out in that story, everyone has feelings. And
right.
so we can all relate to that.
Yeah. And what did you do when things did you do like couples counseling as well?
Yes, right, right. When it was allowed, sometimes if the situation was serious enough, there would be a separation period, and then we might work towards bringing the reconciliation. And that one of the ways in which we would do that is to allow for couples counseling.
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
So that's really interesting. But at the bottom of it is all about the communication,
it
because
is.
that's the wall that can be put up, that is so solid that it's to me, these are my feelings. To me, it's easier to break down a little wall than a big wall. And if you
Mhm.
let things fester too long, it becomes the big tall wall. So,
When couples come into my office, every single time, the first thing that comes out of their mouths is we don't communicate. I call it the big C because it's just universal.
wow. And so I know you have some strategies. You have a sheet that's 16 principles of
16 principles of
communication.
communication. Yep.
We obviously don't
I,
have enough time to go through 16 today, but
right.
maybe we'll have you back to cover another few. But if you had to talk about what you thought were the big three, right? I come from Detroit. We talk about the big three all the time, but
I love
we're
thinking
talking
in
about
threes. I think in
automotive.
threes. So
Yeah. So if you had to talk about the big three pieces of communication, either like, it could be the army, it could be at work, it could be with your partner. Where do you start?
most important piece of communication is wanting to understand where the other person's coming from. Because the point of communication is to reach understanding.
Mm,
As a social worker, I'm a pragmatist. I only care about what works. And so you can't solve a problem if you don't understand it. So it's really important to understand each other so that you can problem solve and then move forward. So I have an expression: the only thing necessary for solving a problem is wanting to, because if that is there, the rest will follow.
that's
So
fabulous. I'm
that's
going to
why
ask
that's
you to
the
say it
most
again.
important, is wanting to understand where the other person's coming from.
That's really important. That really sums up all of communication, right?
Right,
Is
right,
hearing the other person, listening, the importance of listening more than talking. It really goes to the root of it all. I think
right,
that's fabulous.
right.
And do people understand that? Do they kind of get
Oh,
that
yes.
as the thread to move forward?
Yes. I mean, we work toward it. I facilitate that until they until it becomes, second nature to them. But yes, one of the things why I call it principles of communication is because I don't just teach techniques, I teach the why this is important, why this is effective. Understanding what we call the psychodynamics, the underlying motivation why people behave the way that they behave. And when you understand that, it makes more sense. It's easier to employ.
It's interesting, and again, that's a principle. You're psychodynamic. I had never heard of that before, so I think that's really interesting. Um, it applies in so many places, right? Communication is a very broad word, which is why I'm really enjoying on my podcast hearing from people in kind of different spaces within that communication mold. But a lot of it goes back to that whole bottom line about listening and understanding and then making progress.
Mhm.
So those are principles I am, even though I have been in the communications world for over 30 years, I think there's a real piece to continually growing and understanding and reinforcing. So if you're listening to this and you think, well, I've been doing this or I've been acting like this for so many years, how do you approach breaking that cycle? I mean, it's one thing when you're meeting with, 21-year-olds or 23-year-olds that are married. It's another thing when you're meeting with 40 or 45-year-olds who are having these kind of issues. So how do you adjust that conversation and in terms of breaking the patterns of bad communication?
So, I mean, that's the nature of my work. If it were as easy as telling somebody, look, you ought to do it this way, I would be out of a job. I always say, if it were that easy, you could have figured it out on your own. But that's why we're here. I always say people have good reasons for making bad decisions. So it's important to understand the why. In fact, another one of my expressions, I have a lot of expressions, you might have noticed,
I
is
like that. I'm going to
you
repeat
and
it. But well, hold on. People make, say it again.
People have good reasons for making bad decisions. That's what the nature of our work is. When it seems like, why is somebody behaving this way? It's self-destructive or it's destructive to other people. There's always a good reason for it from a psychological perspective. You just need to understand what that is, because you're not going to change it if you don't understand the psychology behind it. So I encourage people to this will date me a little bit, but be like Columbo the detective, but without the trench coat and cigar. So if you're familiar with the show from the 70s, a detective show called Columbo, he always used to walk around with a cigar and wear a trench coat, and he was always asking a lot of questions. And
Right.
so that's what you want to do, is you want to ask yourself a lot of questions. Be curious, compassionately curious. What was I thinking? What was I doing in that moment? What was going on for me that day, that week, that month, that year? What about my background may have contributed to the way that I respond? AKA triggers. We get triggered from past events. So taking that approach of you can't change a behavior if you don't understand the motivation behind it, and that's how I help people change.
Interesting. I did just send an email and said, what do you think that her end game is? Because I can't figure out motivation about something. And
Right.
I'm scared of what I perceive to be her end game. So it's about a third person. So
Right.
what you're, so as listeners, as much as you are learning, I am learning and taking to heart. So I am going to think about when I feel that I have a good reason, but I maybe am making bad decisions. That's something. Thank you very much for under a minute solving my life problem. And all right, so tell me more about, you've got, these principles are so interesting. The one that stuck out to me. Can we talk about the ones that kind of stuck out to me?
Okay.
So what the number 13, which I actually think should be a higher number in this thing, is empathizing is not agreeing.
Right.
And
Yeah,
so,
they're not in any particular order per
oh, okay.
se, except in terms of maybe building on the concept of communication. But yeah, it's funny that you bring that one up, because I was going to talk about that. Empathizing, I think a lot of times people assume that that means that you're saying what the other person's doing is okay, or that you agree with them. But what you're really doing is wanting to understand where the other person is coming from, even though you don't agree. And it's essential to that, what we were just talking about, and it's being compassionately curious of the other person. And so you are like Columbo again, and you ask questions to try to understand. So, for example, let's go back to the example that we used earlier. How you might respond to me, Pam, is, I know that I wasn't ignoring her, but somehow That's the, the impression that she has. So you would be thinking to yourself, okay, tell me more. What was I doing or saying that led you to think that I was ignoring you? Right? That would be an example of empathic listening.
Okay.
Right?
Right. So sadly, the other person could probably say to 99% of the world, you were staring at your phone.
How true, right?
Right.
Right.
Another example of that is that I talk about when I'm leading networking sessions is, we all know that person when you're networking that's looking behind you as you're talking to see who else in the room is more important than you. And while I can't control them, I can suggest to you that that is not behavior you want to model. When you're talking to someone, you should be talking to them because of the value it gives to that person, and you never know where something can lead. And
Right.
we all know that person that's looking over your shoulder to see if it's a fundraising thing, a bigger donor, if it's a business thing, a better connection in their perception. So I really like that idea of empathizing. I'll go back to that, but that doesn't mean you're agreeing. You're just asking more questions. And so I am following up with a good principle of communication that I'm kind of repeating back to you what you said, which means that I understood it the correct way and that it leads to the next thing that you can tell me, because now we're both on the same kind of plane what we're talking about. So if someone said to you, if you said to someone, you're just looking at your phone, that really, and so I guess the empathizing part is I know I do that too, but could we take 5 minutes and turn our phones over so we can just get through this?
So what you might say in that situation is, when you look at your phone, I feel ignored, or I feel like, my company isn't important to you. So, going back to our scenario, really my approach, as I demonstrated, of saying, why are you ignoring me, is actually not good communication either. What I should be doing is not making assumptions, right? So that's the other piece of active listening, or empathic listening, is, on your end, you would make an effort to try to understand where I'm coming from. But on my end, before I assume that you had bad intent, right, I should check in with you. So I don't know if some of your listeners may be familiar with iMessaging, where you say, when you didn't respond to my question, I felt unheard, right? And I responded to that by getting frustrated, right? But I've sort of I've modified that. So I say now is, but I don't want to make any assumptions. So I'm checking in with you first. Is that how you meant to come across? So I would say, when you didn't respond to my question, I felt unheard, but I don't want to make any assumptions. So I'm checking in with you. Is that how you meant to come across? And I'll tell you that 98% of the time, that isn't the person's intention. Even though it might seem malicious, from your perspective, it isn't. Now, that doesn't make them right and you wrong, but it is helpful to know that at least the person's intentions was not to make you feel a certain way.
It's really true. And I think it getting ahead of the communication also often helps with things. So, for example, it wasn't you, Elaine. So just be very clear to everyone listening or watching. It was not Elaine, but someone did change their appointment time to talk to me for the podcast 3 times. And I decided on the 3rd time, if they don't show up, we're going to be done. Because, it's my time and I've put it away, and I want to, celebrate my guests. And so if they're not coming to the table, right? So I made all the assumptions you're talking about. And when she did show up the 3rd time, and she said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I have been wiped out with the flu for 2 weeks. I've been in bed. And I thought to myself, just a quick note saying especially this winter when so many people have been felled by the flu, just a quick note saying, I'm so sorry, I'm sick as a dog. Right? Everyone can understand, appreciate, and certainly empathize with that situation. It ended up being a great call that third time, and she is in my in the queue for the podcast. So again, not saying who it is. But so sometimes it's really important to think about that early stage and what you can do to kind of get ahead of the game.
Yeah. Right, right. That's the key is, by employing these principles, you avoid misunderstandings.
Right. And one of your principles is be transparent.
Yes.
Right. And so that leads me into the third one I'm picking, which is be transparent, and how you look at transparency and how you work with communication skills for people on that.
When I talk about being transparent, what I'm talking about is really about setting boundaries.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So for example, let's say I am in a relationship with an alcoholic, right? And I, rather than trying to talk that person into stop drinking, which rarely works, right? Because if it
Right.
were that easy, they would be doing it. What you can say is, I can't continue to live this way if things don't change. So, what you're doing is you're letting the other person know how you're feeling. And you could use this with any kind of situation. I can't continue to, you know, do this, whatever it is. And so what you're doing is you're also respecting that the other person is their own person, and that it's not your responsibility, nor is your capability to fix or change that person,
Right.
right? All you can do is let them know where you're at, which of course you also owe them. You owe them that, to let them know what you're feeling, rather than doing something behind their back, for example. So that's one example of transparency. So it's also respecting other people's boundaries, right?
Mm-hmm.
um, the second way you can use it is, I use this example at work. Let's say I continue to keep piling more work on you, Pam, right? And you've already got a lot of projects. You can at some point say, okay, so I'm going to let you know, I'm going to be transparent about exactly what you're asking me to do. And so you might include in an email everything that you're doing along the way. So you're not necessarily opposing, right? But you're in a way letting that person know what they're asking you to do. And what I have found is that when my patients have done that, they have gotten supervisors to back off. I
Right.
remember in one case, the supervisor even took on the project himself rather than giving it to her. So, um, you know, a lot of times we make ourselves indispensable. I think women in particular do this,
Right.
and we don't realize that we can set boundaries.
No, that's really important. And sometimes, it's also I've talked with clients about saying, okay, so that I'm happy to take that on. Which of my projects can fall to next week?
Mhm.
Because there's just a certain amount of time. So you're acknowledging it's important. You're acknowledging it's because sometimes, what I found in the past is the response is, oh no, I didn't expect you to do it today. I expect it back by the end of next week. So again, if you had said, if you could get this to me by next week, it would have solved the communication dilemma from the first, and the stress of my getting this email with another thing. But when it doesn't happen, I have found that for me, at least during my career, has been a really good way to focus. I'm currently working on this, and this. Which one can move to next week if this takes priority?
Right. Right. Yep. Yep.
Because
Yes.
often it's just that email that gets sent out because now it's off their desk.
Right. Right.
Oh,
But if you can say, okay, you want me to do this project, so that means I'm going to have to talk to this person. I'm going to have to research this. I'm going to have to write this, whatever. So you're being transparent in that way about what's involved in the project.
right. So I think that's really important. Wow. We could talk for another 30 or 40 or 50 or hours, minutes or hours about these things. This is really, to me, this is really interesting. And I think that our listeners are also going to find it really interesting. And, if you're listening or you're watching, follow us. You can find both of us on LinkedIn. I'm Pamela Lippitt, and Elaine is Elaine Belson, LCSW. And you can feel free to follow or connect with us. Let us know you found us here, and let us know if these things resonated with you. You don't have to give personal examples, but you can say, some of the principles really resonated with me, and I look forward to hearing more. So with that, Elaine, I thank you for today, because this has been intriguing, interesting, applicable in so many parts of our lives in terms of how we communicate with others. So I just thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
All right, folks, we'll see you soon. Follow along and you'll get more wonderful communication advice. Take care, everyone. Hi, this is Pam Lippitt from the Hill Street Group. Thank you for listening to Communication is an Art. Make sure you subscribe and continue to listen. We really appreciate it. Share with your friends all those different lovely things, and we will be back soon. Have a great day.